A veteran and his loyal dog bought the house behind the waterfall, the very place he once dreamed of finding peace. But when he started repairing the old walls, he uncovered a secret someone had been hiding for years. Stay with me for just 1 minute, and I'll tell you about the gunfire, the buried files, and the truth that no one ever expected to surface. A truth that will make you wonder, can loyalty and courage still keep this world turning? No matter where you're watching from tonight, I wish you peace, wherever you are. And don't forget to subscribe to support this channel. Now, let's begin. The road through the Blue Ridge Mountains was the kind that never forgot rain. It wound like an old scar between walls of pine and shale, the mist hanging low enough to blur the edges of the world. The evening light was fading, that pale amber hour when the sky can't decide whether it wants to burn or die. The only sound was the steady growl of the old Ford pickup, its tires hissing on wet gravel, and the faint rhythm of a cane knocking against the dashboard whenever the truck swayed. Raymond Cole had been driving for 6 hours, yet his shoulders stayed locked, as if bracing for another battle that never quite ended. He wasn't going anywhere new. He was simply going far enough from everything that remembered him. The cities had become too loud, the faces too kind, the pity too sweet to swallow. Behind him lay years of service, a chest full of medals that meant less than the limp that carried them, and a silence he'd learned to live with since the day the radio in his hand went dead mid-transmission. He'd stopped chasing peace long ago. Peace had stopped chasing him first. Now he wanted something quieter. Not comfort, just the mercy of being left alone. Beside him sat Max, a German shepherd, 6 years old, coat sable and black, chest broad and proud as if he'd been born in uniform. His eyes were amber, steady, and unblinking, a mirror to every ghost his master refused to speak of. The dog's tail flicked once against the seat whenever the truck hit a pothole, his gaze fixed on the blur of trees outside. Raymond sometimes wondered if Max heard the same things he did in the silence, the hum of memory that never truly left a soldier's mind, the echo of boots long buried beneath sand. The mountain air thickened as they climbed higher. Fog rolled down the slopes like slow white rivers, and the smell of wet pine filled the cab, sharp, clean, almost holy. The old road signs were unreadable now, coated with rust and moss, pointing to towns that had long since fallen off maps. When he passed an abandoned gas station, its windows boarded and its pumps choked with vines, Raymond thought of how time has a habit of erasing the loudest places first. He gripped the wheel tighter, the veins on his knuckles raised like ridges of bark. It was near dusk when the trail narrowed to a single-lane track that looked more like a memory than a road. The GPS had given up an hour ago, leaving only instinct, and veterans always trusted instinct more than machines. Through the windshield, the forest opened briefly, revealing a deep ravine where water shimmered faintly under the fading light. It looked almost silver, a moving mirror carved between cliffs. Somewhere beyond that, the sound began, soft at first, then heavier, the unmistakable rush of falling water. The listing had said mountain cabin with natural waterfall, but what stood before him felt older, as though it had grown from the rock itself. The cabin clung to the cliff's base like something the earth had tried to forget. Its roof sagged under moss, its chimney tilted like a tired soldier, and behind it, the waterfall slid down in a thin, unwavering column of silver light. The sound filled the valley, a steady pulse that seemed to sync with his heartbeat. He turned off the engine. The world fell into silence except for the water. The door creaked when he opened it, the kind of sound that tells you no one's been here for a long time. Max jumped out first, landing soft on the damp ground, nose twitching, muscles coiled. Raymond leaned on his cane and stepped out, his boots sinking slightly into mud. The air tasted of stone and rain and something else. Iron, perhaps, or time. For a moment, he simply stood there, letting the mist bead on his jacket, his breath forming brief ghosts in front of him. The place had a stillness that didn't feel empty, more like waiting. He could almost imagine someone had just stepped out, left the door ajar, and would return any second. The kind of silence that made the skin on your arms remember what danger felt like. He walked slowly toward the porch. The steps held, though they complained under his weight. A bird startled from the rafters, flapping into the trees, and its cry vanished in the endless rush of water. He looked around. Broken shutters, an oil lamp left on its side, a tin bucket full of rainwater turned green with algae. There were tracks, too, faint impressions in the mud, not recent but not ancient either. Max sniffed them, tail stiff, head low. Inside, the air was colder. The first thing Raymond noticed was the smell. Wood smoke, mold, and the ghost of something sweet, like apples gone soft. He ran his hand along the wall, the grain rough beneath his calloused palm. Dust rose in soft clouds that caught the last bit of daylight bleeding through the doorway. There were no pictures, no furniture, only outlines where they once had been. A fireplace with ashes still clinging to shape, a rocking chair half collapsed near the corner. He imagined someone had once sat there, long nights ago, listening to the same sound of water. The rhythm outside grew louder, pressing against the walls until it almost felt like the house itself was breathing. Max trotted toward the back door, ears pricked, growling low. Not the kind of growl meant for warning, but one that came from deep recognition. Raymond followed, his steps careful. The back door opened to a narrow clearing hemmed in by the cliff. The waterfall was closer here, a single graceful stream sliding down the rock like glass. The pool below rippled faintly with light, scattering reflections across the cliff face. And behind that sheet of water, he thought he saw, just for an instant, a shadow. Not a figure exactly, more like the impression of movement, a flicker that didn't belong to light or wind. He blinked. It was gone. "Max," he muttered, his voice rasped by years of sand and smoke. The dog stood at the edge of the pool, head tilted, eyes fixed on the falls. Raymond limped forward, leaning on his cane. The sound was deafening here, a constant thunder that filled his chest. He squinted, trying to see beyond the water, and that's when he heard it. Soft, human, nearly lost under the roar. A voice. It came in fragments, as if carried through the current. The vowels stretched, the consonants dissolved. He couldn't make out words, but it was enough to send a chill crawling up his spine. It was neither echo nor dream. It was familiar. He stepped closer, his breath fogging in front of him, hand brushing the wet rock beside the fall. The vibration of the water pulsed through his fingers like a heartbeat. The voice came again, clearer this time, wrapped in the hiss of spray. "Raymond." The name struck like thunder through bone. He stumbled back, heart hammering, staring into the falling water that now seemed darker, deeper, alive. Max barked once, sharp, urgent, and the sound broke whatever trance had held him. He looked at his reflection wavering on the pool's surface, a man older than he remembered being, framed by mist and rain, a soldier staring into the mouth of something that had been waiting for him all along. He turned toward the cabin. The windows were black, the air trembling with the echo of that voice still clinging to the rocks. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of not knowing, that heavy, electric kind of fear that doesn't make you run but roots you exactly where you stand. Somewhere behind the veil of water, something, or someone, had whispered his name. And the mountain, as if in answer, swallowed the sound whole. Morning came with a slow drizzle, the kind that softened everything it touched, without truly washing anything clean. Mist still clung to the cliffside like a veil, and the waterfall's hum bled into every wall of the cabin. Raymond woke to the sound of tires crunching on gravel, a noise too foreign for this forgotten corner of the mountains. Max was already at the window, ears pricked, tail still, the deep rumble in his throat vibrating like distant thunder. A pickup truck came into view, newer than his, white paint too clean for these roads, wipers moving in precise, practiced strokes. The man who stepped out didn't fit the landscape. Frank Dillard, maybe in his mid-40s, medium height, trim build, the kind of man who ironed his shirt even when visiting the dead. His smile was wide, showing teeth too white for someone who claimed to work real estate in the mountains. A pressed navy jacket, khaki pants spotless despite the mud, and a silver ring that glinted each time he gestured too quickly. His handshake was firm but hollow, his eyes darting away a split second before they met yours, the mark of someone who knew the power of pretending. "Morning, Mr. Cole," he said, voice polished, almost too polite. "Hope the drive wasn't too rough. These back roads can be hell on a truck." Raymond grunted, offering a nod instead of words. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the air between them smelled faintly of oil, sharp and deliberate. Frank clapped his hands together, scanning the cabin as if trying to remember the details he'd rehearsed. "You'll find this place simple but solid," he continued. "Old wood, old plumbing, nothing fancy. Folks around here just call it the Miller place. Been empty for, 8 years or so." Raymond let the man talk, but his eyes moved elsewhere, over the wheel ruts carved too deeply into the mud for just one truck, the clean scrape marks near the back steps, and the shiny brass of new hinges glinting under the eaves where rust should have been. He noticed, too, the faint trace of diesel fuel in the damp air, its bite cutting through the mountain scent of pine and moss. There was no generator, no machinery, nothing to explain why that smell lingered. Frank followed Raymond's gaze for a moment, then cleared his throat. "We had a few handymen out here to patch the place up a bit. Nothing major," he said too quickly, words sliding over themselves like pebbles in rain. "Insurance requires it before transfer." He kept his smile steady, but a flicker passed behind his eyes, the smallest, quickest shadow. Raymond had seen that look before, years ago, right before a man lied on the radio about a mission gone wrong. They toured the house. The realtor spoke in half-truths. Solid beams. No leaks worth mentioning. A bit of mold, nothing dangerous. His voice filled the silence with the confidence of a salesman who knew most buyers didn't listen. But Raymond wasn't most buyers. He touched the wood, knocked on the walls, listened to how they answered. Max padded behind them, nose low, sniffing corners, sometimes letting out a single quiet whine that made Dillard glance uneasily at the dog. When they reached the back porch, Frank hesitated. His polished shoes sank slightly into the mud near the cellar door. The hinges there gleamed too, new steel on old wood. He gave a forced chuckle. Didn't get around to locking that one. Place's got no electricity down there anyway. He turned away before Raymond could respond, gesturing toward the waterfall as if changing the subject would wash away suspicion. Beautiful spot, isn't it? Locals say the sound drives them mad after a while. I think it's peaceful. Raymond stared past him. The falls poured steady and white, catching the gray light like a torn sheet of glass. He could feel the vibration in his chest, low and constant, like the hum of an engine deep beneath the ground. For a fleeting moment, it seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. Max's ears twitched toward it again, the dog's fur bristling down his spine. Frank cleared his throat. Well, Mr. Cole, I'll let you settle in. Papers are all finalized. I've left my card in case you need anything. Repairs, supplies, a contact for propane. His voice softened, as if trying to sound friendly. Truth be told, not many folks stick around this far up. Too quiet for most. He gave a laugh that didn't reach his eyes, then wiped a hand across his jacket sleeve, though no dirt had touched it. When he turned to leave, his shoes left fresh, sharp prints beside the older ones Raymond had noticed earlier, the kind that didn't match his tires at all. The truck engine roared to life, fading down the hill until only the rain and the waterfall remained. Raymond stood for a long moment, watching the mist curl above the rocks. Then he crouched by the cellar door. The hinges were warm to the touch, faintly metallic, not the chill of old iron. Someone had replaced them recently, within days, maybe hours. He pressed his palm to the damp wood, feeling something faint beneath it. Not sound exactly, but a vibration, like a whisper caught in the grain. That night, the mountains sank into fog. The moon rose pale and swollen, its light bending through the mist until the waterfall shimmered silver like molten glass. Inside, the fireplace crackled weakly, painting the cabin walls in soft amber and smoke. Raymond sat in the old armchair near the hearth, cane resting against his leg, hands wrapped around a tin mug of coffee gone cold. Max lay by his feet, chin on his paws, eyes half closed but never fully at ease. The wind shifted once, rattling the window frame. The sound of water outside thickened, pressing against the cabin like a living thing. Raymond leaned forward slightly, listening. It wasn't just the falls. There was something layered beneath it, a rhythm too deliberate to be nature. He glanced toward the back window. Beyond the glass, everything was drowned in silver and shadow. Max lifted his head, ears rising like antennae. His body stiffened. A low growl began deep in his chest, slow, measured, primal. Raymond set the mug down quietly, the clink echoing too loud in the stillness. He reached for the old flashlight on the table but didn't switch it on. Instead, he let his eyes adjust to the pale gleam of the moon filtering through the mist. And then he saw it. A flicker, faint but unmistakable, behind the curtain of falling water. A flashlight beam, small and unsteady, cutting briefly through the cascade before vanishing as quickly as it came. No reflection, no trick of moonlight. Someone had been there, on the other side of the falls. The roar of the water swallowed everything else. For a long moment, Raymond sat frozen, his breath shallow, every muscle waiting for the world to move again. Max's growl faded into silence, replaced by a tense, watchful stillness. The cabin's fire sputtered, sending a final spark into the air before dying into embers. Outside, the waterfall shimmered silver and endless. Inside, Raymond's heart began to beat with that same steady rhythm, each pulse echoing the thought that now refused to leave his mind. He wasn't alone up here. The third morning came gray and cold, the kind of mountain dawn that turns breath into smoke and silence into a language of its own. Raymond rose early, the stiffness in his leg an old friend that arrived before the sun. The fog clung low over the trees outside, and the waterfall had changed its voice. No longer a soft murmur, but a deep, unbroken roar that seemed to fill every hollow of the land. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of wet timber and ash from last night's dying fire. Max followed him room to room, his paws soundless on the floorboards, his head turning with each small noise the house made, as if it too were speaking in a tongue only they could understand. Days passed like that, slow, quiet, uneasy. Raymond kept himself busy with repairs, telling his body to move before his mind could think. He fixed the shutters, tightened loose nails, swept away cobwebs older than most lies. But as the light faded each evening, something in the cabin shifted. The creaks grew heavier, deeper, carrying weight like footsteps overhead. Even Max, unshakable in all his soldiers' calm, began to stir at sounds that never belonged to wind or water. Sometimes, just before sleep, Raymond could swear he heard wood breathing. On the fourth day, he turned his attention to the bedroom, the smallest one at the end of the narrow hall. It faced the cliff, and the window there looked directly at the waterfall. The glass was streaked with old rain and the faint outline of a handprint long faded. Against the far wall stood a heavy dresser, oak darkened by age, one leg uneven so that it tilted ever so slightly, like something resisting rest. Dust covered its surface in a fine gray film, soft as flour. He tried to move it to sweep behind, but it groaned under his grip, the drawers swollen from damp. Raymond fetched his crowbar from the porch, the same one he'd used to mend the window frames, and wedged it carefully under the side. The wood moaned as it gave way. Then, a sound. Not the usual creak of tired timber, but a hollow thud, low and distinct, as if the wall behind it had lungs of its own. He froze. The mountain wind howled outside, but the noise had come from within, deep in the wall, almost answering his movement. He set the crowbar again, slower this time, prying gently along the baseboard. The tip caught on something metallic. He pushed. The plank came loose, releasing a small cloud of dust that shimmered briefly in the slant of light from the window. Behind it, wedged between two beams, was a metal box no larger than a loaf of bread. Gray, taped tight, edges dented, as though it had been forced into hiding rather than placed. Raymond pulled it free, his fingers leaving prints in the layer of grime. It was heavier than it looked. Max stood at his side now, ears up, tail still. The man felt the strange familiarity of weight, not of the object itself, but of what it meant to hold something that once belonged to another life. He set it on the floorboards, knelt, and peeled back the brittle tape. The sound was small but sharp, the sound of something sealed for years, surrendering to air. Inside lay old service patches, the colors faded, the thread edges frayed like wounds that had learned to close but not heal. Beneath them were photographs, half burned, faces eaten away by flame. Soldiers in uniform, a desert horizon behind them, a single figure half turned toward the camera. His own. He recognized the stance before the mind could name it. And at the bottom of the box, gleaming faintly under the weak light, lay a dog tag. His name was there, Raymond Cole. But the numbers, the date stamped beneath, froze him. It read 2 years after he'd been discharged. 2 years after the war had already spat him back into the world with nothing but a limp and nightmares. The breath left his chest, like a wound reopening. The air around him seemed to tighten. His mind tried to reject the logic of it, yet the metal didn't lie. Someone had forged his existence after he'd walked away, kept him alive on paper when his body had long been done serving. He turned the tag over. The edges were smooth, worn by handling. Whoever had made it had done so with care, almost reverence. For a moment, he thought of the man he'd once been, the one who believed in codes and comradeship, the one who thought duty ended when the uniform came off. But now, holding that small piece of metal, he understood that some wars never filed their paperwork to close. He sat back, staring at the box's contents spread before him. The photograph smoked faintly with the smell of burnt plastic and dust. He reached for one, brushing away the soot, revealing half a smile he remembered. A fellow soldier named Blake, maybe, or Carter. It didn't matter. The image dissolved where heat had touched it most. He wondered who had hidden this, who had wanted these fragments buried behind his wall. Max nudged his knee, breaking the spell. The dog's breath was warm, grounding, but his eyes were fixed toward the far corner of the room. His ears twitched, nostrils flaring. Then came a sound, faint, distant, but undeniable, dripping water, echoing somewhere inside the walls. Not the waterfall's endless rush, but something closer, slower, deliberate, like a leak where no pipe ran. Raymond listened. The rhythm matched nothing natural. It came in threes, paused, then again, the pattern of intent. He stood slowly, every joint feeling the weight of memory pressing in. The air had changed, thicker, colder, carrying the mineral tang of stone soaked too long in shadow. He looked toward the window. The falls outside roared louder than before, their spray flashing white as lightning in the dim light. For the first time, it seemed to fill not just the valley, but the cabin itself, as though the mountain had leaned closer to listen. Raymond set the tag on the dresser. His reflection in the cracked mirror above it was faint, ghosted by dust. He saw the outline of his own face overlapping the burned one in the photograph still on the floor. The thought came uninvited, that maybe the life he thought he'd escaped had only gone underground, flowing beneath everything like the water outside. Maybe it had been waiting, reshaping itself until it could call him back. Max pressed closer to his leg, ears pinned, a low whine trembling from his chest. The noise in the wall had stopped, but the air vibrated as if something unseen had stepped back into the dark, watching. Raymond reached for the dog tag again, the metal cold as rainwater. He turned it once more in his hand, the engraved letters glinting briefly before the light shifted and swallowed them whole. He didn't speak. He couldn't. The silence that followed was too complete to break. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy silence that comes right before truth walks through the door. Outside, the waterfall thundered on, relentless, endless. And somewhere beneath that roar, beneath the breath of mist and the memory of names carved into steel, Raymond Cole felt it. The undeniable weight of realization pressing against his chest. His past had been rewritten. The rain started again just before sunset. A slow and uncertain drizzle that blurred the mountain road into streaks of gray and gold. Raymond kept both hands steady on the wheel as the wipers beat out a rhythm older than the truck itself. The town of Fairview Hollow appeared at the edge of the valley, a scatter of rusted signs, shuttered stores, and gas pumps that looked like they'd been forgotten halfway through a conversation. He hadn't been down there in years. Maybe no one had. Max rode in the passenger seat, his head level with the window, eyes tracking the falling rain as though every drop might be a signal he was meant to read. The veteran said nothing. He didn't need to. The sound of water filled the silence between them. Not the roar of the waterfall now, but the endless whisper of rain on the roof, the kind that carried the weight of something waiting to be understood. The diner stood just before the bridge, a squat building with chipped red paint and a neon sign that buzzed faintly even when the power flickered. Inside, the light was the color of weak coffee. Raymond stepped through the door and was met with that old, familiar smell of grease and paper napkins. The waitress behind the counter, gray hair tied back, half-moon glasses slipping down her nose, looked up and gave a polite nod before returning to her crossword. Only one other person sat in the booth by the window, a woman with silver hair pinned in a loose bun, wrapped in a green wool coat that had once been expensive. She looked up when the door creaked shut. Her face softened, not in recognition, but in that quiet instinct people get when they sense a shared kind of damage. Raymond hesitated before walking closer. "Mara Jennings?" he asked. The woman's expression changed. Not surprise exactly, but something deeper, like a clock rewinding by mistake. Her voice, when it came, was soft and brittle around the edges. "I haven't heard that name spoken by a soldier in 20 years. She gestured for him to sit. The booth squeaked under his weight. Up close, her features came into clearer focus. Early 70s, skin pale and lined like parchment folded too many times. Eyes the color of dusk, gray-green, reflective. She had the look of someone who'd spent her life caring for others, but never figured out what to do with her own heart afterward. Her hands, resting on the table, still trembled slightly, even when still. Raymond took out the dog tag from his pocket and placed it between them. The metal glinted faintly under the flickering light. Mara's fingers stopped trembling. She stared at it for a long time, then lifted her gaze to his face. "You were supposed to be dead," she whispered. The words fell into the air like ashes, small but heavy enough to choke on. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The look on her face told him she already knew the question. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small notebook, bound in cracked leather, edges frayed. "You weren't the only one," she said, voice low, almost as if she feared the walls might be listening. "I was a nurse at Ridgeview Veterans Hospital. Back then, they told us we were treating trauma, brain fatigue, memory loss, post-combat tremors. But we weren't treating anything. We were testing." She looked down at the tag again, her thumb tracing his name. "They called it Echo Rain," she continued. "An experimental program, part chemical, part psychological. They wanted to find out how far they could push memory, how much of a man's identity could be rewritten before his mind broke." Her voice quavered slightly. "You were one of the later cases. A volunteer, they said. But by then no one was volunteering for anything." Raymond sat still. The words moved through him slowly, like cold water filling his lungs. "Why bury it?" he asked finally. "Because it went wrong," she said simply. "The tests caused seizures, hallucinations, violence. One man set fire to his own ward. Another walked out into the river and never came back. The program collapsed overnight. The military scrubbed the records, changed the names, declared some soldiers dead on paper, convenient ghosts to hide the trail." She swallowed hard. "You were one of them. That tag in your wall? It wasn't left by accident. It was a warning. Someone wanted you to remember before someone else decided you shouldn't." Max shifted beneath the table, his tail brushing against Raymond's boot. The veteran leaned back, his breath steady but his jaw set tight. Outside the window, headlights passed over the bridge, slicing through rain before vanishing again. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was full of what was lost, of what was known too late to matter. When Mara finally spoke again, her tone had changed. Softer, almost pleading. "Whatever's inside that house, Mr. Cole, whatever's behind that water, don't try to open it. You can't unlearn what they made you forget." She looked out toward the bridge, where the fog now rolled in waves like restless ghosts crossing from one side to the other. They called it echo rain for a reason. The mind repeats what it hears, even when the world wants it silent. He nodded slowly, not in agreement, but acknowledgement. Some truths didn't need belief to exist. He slid the dog tag back into his pocket, the metal warm from her touch. Then he stood. "Thank you," he said simply. She didn't stop him when he left. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving only the sound of the river rushing below the bridge, a quieter cousin of the waterfall that guarded his home. He paused there for a moment, resting his hand on the railing. The metal was slick, cold, almost pulsing beneath his fingers, like the heartbeat of the mountain itself. Max stood beside him, nose lifted to the damp air. Somewhere far off, thunder muttered against the horizon. The drive back up the mountain was longer than it should have been. Fog gathered thick again, swallowing the road until the headlights became two pale orbs swimming in milk. The higher he climbed, the heavier the quiet became, pressing against the windshield like invisible hands. The house came into view at last, its silhouette crouched beneath the cliff, the waterfall behind it glowing faintly in the dark like a curtain of moving glass. Raymond parked and killed the engine. For a while, he didn't move. The night had that strange stillness that only happens when something is waiting to happen. Max jumped down first, sniffing the ground, tail lowered. The air smelled different, sharp, metallic, tinged with something faintly acrid, like old smoke. He climbed the steps to the porch, the boards creaking underfoot, and then he saw it, a note nailed dead center to the wooden door. The paper was damp, edges curling, the ink running in small rivulets like veins. He reached out and peeled it free. The hammer's impression still marked the grain of the wood. 3 perfect circles. He turned the paper toward the faint porch light. The handwriting was jagged, hurried, and unmistakably human. 4 words, each one pressed deep enough to tear the page. "Don't open what the water keeps." Raymond stood there in the wet silence, the words bleeding slightly beneath his thumb. Behind him, the waterfall roared louder than before. Or maybe it only sounded that way now that he knew what it might be hiding. Max stood at the edge of the steps, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the trees. Somewhere out there, a branch snapped once, clean and close. The veteran folded the paper and slipped it into his coat pocket without a word. His eyes lingered on the black curtain of water behind the cabin, the endless fall of sound that had once seemed almost comforting. Now it felt like breathing from something too large to name. He turned toward the door, but didn't go inside. The air was heavy enough to hold its own voice, and though he would never admit it out loud, part of him already knew. Whatever the water was keeping, it had finally started to notice him back. The night was colder than it had any right to be. A thin frost crept across the stones, and the air smelled faintly of iron and rain. The mountains were silent except for the low growl of the waterfall, steady as a heartbeat in the dark. Raymond stood by the porch, the damp paper from the door now folded in his coat pocket. The words, "Don't open what the water keeps," pressing against his chest, like a loaded truth. He had lived his life obeying orders, and this, whatever this was, felt like one last command he could no longer follow. Beside him, Max waited, tail low, breath visible in white bursts, his eyes fixed on the black line of mist rising from behind the cabin. Raymond adjusted the strap of his flashlight, the beam cutting through fog in trembling silver. "Let's go, boy," he murmured, voice low, more to himself than to the dog. Max trotted ahead without hesitation, muscles moving under his coat like coiled rope. Together they crossed the narrow clearing, mud clinging to their boots and paws, until they reached the path that vanished into the roar. The closer they came, the heavier the air grew, dense with spray and the cold breath of water slamming against stone. The sound filled every thought, leaving no room for fear, only the rhythm of movement. The trail was hardly a path at all, just slick rock and patches of moss that glowed faintly green under the flashlight. Behind the wall of falling water, darkness shifted and trembled, each ripple reflecting fragments of light like broken glass. Raymond felt the sting of cold spray against his face as he stepped closer. The beam flickered over the wet stone, revealing a narrow gap, half concealed by overgrown ferns and time itself. He slipped through, Max following close at his side, and the noise of the world above vanished like a curtain being drawn. Inside, the air was still, too still. The chamber opened into a space carved by human hands, not nature's. Rusted metal lined the walls, bolts the size of his fist hammered into the rock. On the far side, a sealed iron door loomed, its surface corroded with age yet strangely intact. Someone had tried to weld it shut, and the faint scorch marks still clung to the edges like black fingerprints. The handle was gone, replaced by a slab of iron plate bolted across the center, marked with letters so faded he had to trace them with his thumb to read ER Logistics. He knew what those initials meant before his mind dared to say them. Echo Rain. The words landed in his chest like a slow detonation. Max sniffed at the base of the door, ears twitching. The dog let out a single sharp bark that bounced back from the stone walls, swallowed by the cave's throat. Raymond dropped to one knee, running his fingers along the seam of the door. The metal was cold, but there was a faint vibration beneath it, a pulse that didn't belong to anything mechanical. He pressed his ear closer, listening. The same rhythm as the waterfall above, slow, endless, patient. The flashlight beam swept across the walls, and his breath caught. Old crates stood in neat rows, stacked to the ceiling, their sides stamped with the same faded insignia. The wood was damp, labels peeling, but the stenciled markings were clear enough. Property of ER Logistics Division, Ridgeview Sector. Dust drifted from the ceiling with every drip of water, settling over everything like ash. It wasn't just a room. It was a tomb, one built for secrets, not bodies. Raymond took out the small recorder from his jacket, a weathered military model, the kind that still worked when nothing else did. He thumbed the switch. A faint red light blinked. His voice, when it came, was steady, but carried the weight of years that had never found peace. "If anyone finds this," he said, his tone measured, deliberate like confession, "tell them we never stopped serving. They ended the mission on paper, but they kept us alive in their shadows. This is Echo Rain, and it's still breathing." He paused, the sound of dripping water counting seconds. "They rewrote who we were, made ghosts out of men. I think this place is where they kept the proof." The words hung in the cold air, the tape spinning softly. Max turned suddenly, a low growl rumbling through him, hackles rising along his spine. Raymond froze, eyes narrowing toward the darker end of the chamber. The air shifted, that subtle, unmistakable pressure that comes when another body enters a confined space. From the shadows beyond the last row of crates, a figure stepped forward. The flashlight caught the edge of a sleeve first, then a face, pale, drawn tight, lips pressed in a line that tried to hide recognition. Frank Dillard. His slick hair was plastered to his forehead from the damp, his coat no longer crisp but soaked and clinging. In his right hand gleamed the dull outline of a pistol, its barrel dark as the void behind him. "You were never supposed to find this," Frank said, voice steady but trembling at the edges. The same salesman's tone, only stripped of its charm, the hollow ring of a man reciting orders he didn't believe in. "You don't understand what this place is. You were meant to stay dead." Raymond didn't move. The flashlight's beam cut across Frank's face, revealing eyes that had long since given up pretending they were his own. "You work for them," Raymond said quietly. It wasn't a question. Frank's jaw clenched. "I clean up for them. That's all any of us do now." He took a step closer, raising the gun slightly. "They told me if anyone ever found this place, I was to make sure it stayed buried. And then you showed up, with your dog and your goddamn questions." The sound of the waterfall above seemed to fade, replaced by the slow drip of water hitting stone, one drop, then another, as if time itself were holding its breath. Raymond's hand twitched toward his cane, but he didn't reach for it. "You think burying it again will make it right?" he asked, voice low, tired more than angry. Frank's face softened for the briefest second, guilt flickering like a candle fighting wind. "It's not about right," he whispered. "It's about surviving the cleanup." Then the gun moved. Max lunged. The world erupted. The bark came first, sharp, deafening, followed by the sound of metal scraping stone and a single flash of light brighter than the cave could contain. The pistol's report cracked through the chamber, its echo slamming against the walls and racing up the tunnel like thunder chasing its own tail. For an instant, the flashlight spun from Raymond's hand, bouncing across the floor, its beam slicing wildly over the iron door, the crates, the dog, and the man holding the gun. Then, silence. A silence so complete that even the waterfall above seemed to stop breathing. And after that, the sound returned. Slow, distant, impossible to place. The echo of gunfire rolling through the canyon, carried by the water's endless voice. Dawn arrived not with brilliance, but with mercy. The rain had eased into a hush, and the mist hung low across the ridges like a shroud being lifted after a long vigil. The storm had done its work, washing the mountain clean, rinsing away the blood and the lies that had clung to its stones for too long. Down by the ravine, the waterfall gleamed pale gold in the new light. Its roar softened into something almost human, a voice that mourned and forgave at once. The air smelled of wet pine and metal, the scent of endings and beginnings sharing the same breath. The first sound beyond the water was the rhythmic chop of rotor blades. A helicopter broke through the fog, its shape dark against the morning sky. Two more followed, their lights sweeping across the cliffs and valleys like searching eyes. They came not for the dead, but for the truth left behind. The signal Raymond had managed to send before the gunfire, a simple emergency ping transmitted through his old military radio, had reached the right ears after all. Now, men in dark windbreakers and insignia-less uniforms moved with deliberate steps through the wreckage of secrets the world had tried to bury. They found Frank Dillard first, his body lying half-submerged near the iron door, pistol still in hand, the same false charm erased from his face. The cave walls were streaked with mud and the faint metallic gleam of shell casings. Evidence was everywhere. The crates marked ER Logistics, the dog tags, the files Raymond had gathered before the confrontation. None of it staged, none of it deniable. The history of Echo Rain had come back to the surface like a drowned truth refusing to stay under. And then they found Max. The German shepherd stood over his master, chest heaving, fur matted with mud and rain, eyes alert but unyielding. He didn't bark when they approached, only stared, head lowered, body tensed like a soldier guarding the last line. Raymond lay still, his coat dark with blood, his hand half curled as though he had tried to hold on to something unseen. For a moment the agents hesitated. It was hard to tell who had saved whom. Then one of them, an older man with the same haunted eyes veterans recognize in each other, knelt and spoke softly. "It's all right, boy. We've got him." Max didn't move until the man placed a hand on Raymond's shoulder and felt the faint, stubborn rhythm beneath his ribs. Slow, shallow, but there. Only then did the dog step aside, trembling, eyes never leaving the stretcher as they lifted his master into the light. The helicopter blades roared again, scattering mist and memories alike. And as the craft rose, the mountain gave a low rumble, as if exhaling, relieved that someone had finally heard its confession. Weeks later, the cabin looked different. The scars of the storm had healed, and the wood gleamed under a coat of fresh oil. The porch railing had been repaired, and a small American flag hung quietly near. The steps, its fabric faded but proud. Raymond sat there in the soft glow of afternoon, a blanket over his legs, bandages peeking from beneath his sleeves. The cane rested beside him, though he used it less these days. His gaze drifted toward the waterfall, where the sunlight broke through the spray in sheets of molten gold. Max lay nearby, muzzle gray with soot, his body stretched across the boards, one paw resting near Raymond's boot. Every so often, the dog's ears flicked toward the sound of birds returning to the trees, or to the low hum of insects reclaiming the valley. There was peace in the air now, the kind that comes not from forgetting, but from having survived the remembering. A small car pulled up near the gate that afternoon. Out stepped Mara Jennings, wearing a denim jacket too big for her and a scarf the color of autumn leaves. Her face had softened since their last meeting, the lines around her eyes less guarded. She carried a box under one arm, books, letters, small things salvaged from the wreck of the past. When she reached the porch, she smiled. "They cleared the site this morning," she said. "They're calling it a containment facility, but they're not hiding it anymore. Reporters will come. People will ask questions." Raymond nodded slowly. "They should." Mara looked out toward the falls. "And what about you? What will you do now?" He hesitated, then gestured to the open land stretching beyond the porch, the fenced field, the path leading toward the stream. "Build something," he said. "Something that gives the living a reason to stay." It began small, a few workers from the town, a carpenter, 2 young veterans who had heard whispers of what he'd done. Together, they cleared the field, leveled the ground, and raised the frame of a new lodge from the bones of the mountain. Kennels stood beside it, shaded and sturdy. Mara planted flowers along the walk, wild columbines and mountain asters that caught the morning dew. On the signpost near the road, Raymond painted the name himself in thick white letters. The Haven Beneath the Falls. It wasn't a memorial, though it carried ghosts in its walls. It was a refuge, a place for soldiers and their dogs, for the wounded who still woke at night to sounds they couldn't explain. Each morning, the valley filled with movement, the bark of animals, the sound of laughter carried through mist, the faint echo of hammers building what pain had once torn down. Mara came often, her hands steady now as she worked alongside him, her quiet presence as much a comfort as the sound of water nearby. As weeks turned to months, the seasons softened. The mountain no longer felt haunted, but alive, as if forgiving itself. Raymond walked each day to the foot of the waterfall, Max trotting ahead, his coat catching the spray like silver thread. They would stop by the edge of the pool, where moss grew thick and the water ran clear enough to see the reflection of sky. Sometimes he would speak to the water, not loudly, but as though addressing an old friend. Sometimes the water hides what men can't face, he would murmur, his hand resting on Max's head. But it never forgets. And maybe it was imagination, or maybe it was something else. But each time, when the wind shifted and the mist curled back toward him, it almost felt like the mountain was answering. Not with sorrow or warning, but with a quiet acknowledgement, a whisper through the roar that carried no grief, only forgiveness. At dusk, the sun dipped behind the ridge, turning the waterfall into a ribbon of fire. Raymond would sit on the porch as the day closed, his silhouette framed by golden light, the dog lying close by, and the sound of water rising like a hymn. Above them, the world kept moving, but here, beneath the falls, time seemed to breathe instead of pass. And when night came, he'd look at the valley below, the lights of the cabins flickering softly, laughter carried faint on the air, and he'd think of all the names lost to the silence of history. Some had been buried, others erased, but here, under the eternal voice of the mountain, they had found a home again. The haven stood not as proof of what was done, but of what could still be mended. And through the endless sound of falling water, the promise remained, that even the deepest wounds, once uncovered, could be washed clean by grace. Some stories don't end when the mission does. They linger in the spaces between raindrops, in the quiet breath of a loyal dog, in the echo of a man who refused to let silence have the final word. There are people like that in this world, the kind who don't make headlines, who carry their battles quietly, patching broken fences, rebuilding small places where hope can live again. You might pass them on the street and never know what storms they've survived, or what promises they still keep. Loyalty, courage, kindness, they rarely announce themselves. They show up in the smallest gestures, a hand that steadies, a voice that forgives, a soul that stays when everyone else has gone. And maybe that's what the world needs most, not louder heroes, but gentler ones. The kind who listen when the world turns away, the kind who stand guard, even after the fight is done. Because sometimes, the quietest hearts carry the loudest courage. And when the water keeps falling, long after names are forgotten, its song reminds us. Mercy never truly leaves. It just waits for someone brave enough to hear it again.